Okay, hello everyone. We're going to be talking about Gerald Dworkin's The Case for Organ Sales. The article is very short, so if you haven't read it, go ahead. It's very breezy, easy to read, and pretty fun. So the kind of diverse views on the topic of organ sales have been evolving. So in the past, mostly considered incompatible with medical ethics, the sale of organs, that is, and they viewed the reliance on altruism and donation of organs as being a positive rather than a negative. But now the reliance on organ sales on organ supply from donation and altruism is viewed as kind of a limiting factor on the supply of organs and not necessarily anything that's inherently problematic. There's views that are pretty nuanced on this, but a lot of people don't think that the markets are as bad as previously thought. So let's get into it. First, it would be nice to get a couple of moral and conceptual hurdles off of the table. So the first one is that mostly we're talking about degradation and exploitation is what Dworkin identifies. So degradation is failing to take the appropriate value for something or someone. So treating a painting, Renaissance painting, as a table mat would be an example, although a silly one. Exploitation involves taking unfair advantage of people's situation, and this is a bit of a Marxian critique on markets. If you notice that Marx was mostly concerned about exploitation of the working class. So a lot of people in that camp like to problematize organ sales for these reasons. There's some issues of whether or not you own your body, because if you do own your body, then organ sales are pretty uncomplicated. You can sell basically all of your other property. So if it were the case that your body was your property, you could sell organs and it wouldn't be an issue, right? But we have to ask a couple questions here, and we kind of get a bit hung up on property ownership not being a very good model for the body. So it's not clear how you come to own your body. So it's not through labor, it's not through purchasing, you don't really get gifted it. Some religious views think that God gifts your body, but broadly, people don't believe in these kinds of ownership acquisition things. And if this comes out, if we talk about what property damage and what assault is, it seems like we have different language for a deep moral reason. So on the one hand, we have vandalism. On the other hand, we have assault. If you're damaging someone's body, it's a lot more severe. And we put it into a distinct category, essentially, from vandalism and damaging property. These are not just boring semantic linguistic distinctions. They seem to be something more important, morally speaking, that bodies aren't property and they can't be vandalized or damaged. People are assaulted. They're not harmed in the way that objects are. So if the body were property, we could wonder as well if it would be subject to taxation and what that would look like. So these are some problematic positions for the case that your body is property. So getting back to Dworkin, so Dworkin is going to be concerned with the moral arguments against organ sales, not with the practical questions about how to overcome those obstacles to such policy. So if you're thinking that it's just simply infeasible to instantiate organ sales, that's not necessarily, although it could be an objection to Dworkin. The case where it isn't is that it's just kind of hard to get it going at first, and there'll be problems that we have to solve along the way. Not really a great objection because he's mostly concerned with the moral arguments. It's worthy to note that in the United States, in terms of organ sales, or organ donation, it is an opt-in system. And what that means is that if you go to the DMV to register your driver's license, they might ask you, or they might not even ask you, but you have to affirm that you are a organ donor to actually be an organ donor. Whereas Europe uses more of an opt-out system, so there's no question. It's just you're opted in. If you have a complaint about it, you can opt out and become and not become an organ donor if you should perish in like a motor vehicle accident or whatever. But the idea is that opt-in systems require you to actively, voluntarily assent to do it, where opt-out systems assume that you are assenting by not opting out. So there's some obvious advantages to the opt-out system, which is that you have more organs, right? You don't people who would have opted in if they knew the option or had to opt out, you miss out on those organs. But the opt-in system is a bit more. You can be a bit more sure that people who are opting in are voluntarily assenting to the organ donation process, and whether or not you think that it's a harm to have your organs harvested or not will kind of hinge on whether or not we think either one of these is more justified, but we won't get into that just yet. So Dworkin distinguishes a couple different cases of organ markets. There's a current market and a futures market. So the futures market is something like the organs will become available when the person is deceased. And this is taking from basic economics, like futures markets and current markets. And then current markets are where organs are taken from the living. So in cases where the organs are available now, and it just is dependent upon when the living wants to actually donate it, if they do. So Dworkin thinks that it's going to be much harder to justify the case of the current market, which is in living people rather than dead, in terms of organ sales. So he aims to defend the current market and to get the futures market as a kind of entailment, because it seems like justifying the sale in living people is much harder because the burdens are higher on the consenting person who is donating. So this means that he thinks he can prove both, but he's just talking about the more burdensome strand, which is in the sale of organs in living people. So he first presents arguments in favor of organ sales, and then he kind of rebuts the objections that he thinks about, and he concludes that if these objections are all that you can think of, and he is convincing on refuting the objections to his position, then we should think that the sale of organs is permissible. So presently, Dworkin kind of just observes that we accept legitimacy of non-commercial organ sales. So donation, we accept that as being legitimate. And this seems to indicate that we have a belief that individuals have the right to dispose of their organs. And if that's unproblematic, then adding in the market for Dworkin just seems to be not really problematic for him. And Dworkin even goes a bit further in defending the idea of autonomy. So he thinks that respecting people's wishes to sell organs or dispose of organs is a way to respect autonomy. And this gets into different strands of autonomy. I'll just flag them really quickly. So some strands of moral views believe that self-limiting autonomy is not autonomy. It's not actually expressing. If I was, for instance, to drink a bunch of alcohol and lower my autonomous volition, that would be, for some theorists, that would be a form of increasing my autonomy. And for others, it would be a form of decreasing my autonomy. For Dworkin, he thinks that respecting bodily autonomy is not self-limiting. So that means that if you choose to limit your bodily autonomy by doing away with your body, by donating or selling it, this is actually a instantiation of bodily autonomy. It doesn't limit it. So recognizing such a right produces good consequences as well. So he gives a pretty broad moralistic defense. So he's defending the kind of more deontological strand, which is the rights-based strand, and the utilitarian or consequentialist strand in one paper. So doing this respects, not only does it respect bodily autonomy, it produces good consequences and more lives are saved. So what's the exact drawback, we might ask? It's not clear in Dworkin's eyes. So the primary good isn't that there's these good effects that he just noted, but it's that it respects bodily autonomy for him. So for Dworkin, this gets back to the self-limiting thing. If you give permission for people to touch your body or remove part of it, this is respecting bodily autonomy. You might disagree, and you might think that bodily autonomy requires not splitting the body or something else. We'll get to an objection about that in a bit, towards the end of the lecture. But for right now, just think about whether or not it's self-limiting or not. So if you could sell part of your body, is that instantiation of bodily autonomy? Dworkin thinks it is. So getting to the kind of the market aspect of this argument. So voluntary exchange is Pareto improving. What does that mean? So Pareto improving means that in a exchange system, if you have a exchange like the one at the bottom of the screen here, one caveman wants a rock, one wants a stick. They both prefer the other object to the one that they possess. So if they exchange, both of them are made better off by their own judgments, and no one's made worse off. And that's what Pareto improving means. It means at least no one is made worse off by an exchange, and someone's made better off. So if it were the case that, let's say the caveman with a stick was indifferent, he could take a rock or a stick, he's made no worse off by accepting the exchange, but the caveman with a rock is greatly improved in his position. It doesn't mean that the caveman has to trade, that is indifferent. He might not. He might think that exchange is costly. But the point is that if you made the exchange, it would improve the caveman with the rock and not actually harm the caveman with a stick. This is Pareto improvement. Dworkin argues that organ sale is Pareto improving. That is, increases everybody's well-being without making anyone worse off. So some of the arguments against organ sale. You might think that organs are more important than other market items and should be heavily regulated for that reason. You might also object if consent is really viable. So you might think that saying yes in the DMV is not a thick enough consent to actually pass the bar of donating organs. And similarly, you might think that the pressure of the money might make the consent invalid. We might also have like lack of information, and also one of the strands is that there's the commodification of people, seems wrong. This is like the degradation argument that we mentioned. Also, the exploitation kind of works into the commodification aspect. And deciding about price seems problematic. Like, what price do we set for organs? Do we just let the market handle it, or do we have some kind of minimum, some kind of maximum, etc.? So getting back to the idea that we don't own ourselves. So the kind of, this is the way a logical proof proceeds. So we have premise one, which is that if our bodies were property, then we could sell ourselves. If we can't sell ourselves, then we don't own ourselves. So we have these first two premises, which are going to support the conclusion of the conclusion that is we don't own ourselves. And now from that, we can kind of infer that to to look at the inference rule, so we have premise 1 is going to be if P then Q. Premise 2 is not Q. So modus tollens tells us we can infer that there's not P. So what this means is that, so premise 1 here is P, this is Q. So we have the inference if P then Q. So if our bodies were property, then we could sell ourselves. That's premise 1 down here. And premise 2 is that not Q. So from that, we can infer that there's not P, which is we don't own ourselves. So if these two premises are true, then it seems to follow that the conclusion is true. If it's sound and valid, we won't get into the specifics for now, but this is kind of a toy argument for why we don't own ourselves. So it seems like we're people, right? What this is getting at is seems to imply that we're people, we're not objects, and people can be injured but not vandalized. Talked about this a little bit earlier, and it's degrading to have a price put on people, especially different prices for the same organ, perhaps just because some people are richer than other people, so the price for them donating is going to be higher in the case of them being richer. We might ask if this difference in market valuation implies that we have different worth, and if that difference in worth is contradictory of our moral, of us being free and equal people, which is standardly required of democracy. So the thing that we're kind of getting at here is that if organ sales are different from taking dangerous jobs, so this is the comparison that Dworkin makes. Dworkin points out that donating a kidney is no more harmful than commuting a couple minutes to work each morning. And if it's the case that it's not risky, why can't we consent to this kind of procedure where we make money if it's no more harmful than commuting to work? So organ sales from the living involve intending to do something to someone's body that induces a pathology. So if you hire someone for a dangerous job, it doesn't intend bodily damage but foresees risk. So this is slightly a different kind of aspect here, where on one hand it seems like they're similar in terms of overall risk, but in the case of organ sales, you're intending the harm, and when you're doing the job, it's just kind of a hazard. So there is a bit of a disanalogy here with the cases. I'll leave it for you to decide if it's morally relevant difference, if intending the harm in the case of donation is significantly different from the having a job that's just risky. So Dworkin is responding to the charge that organ sales will lead to unfair distribution of organs. And this is going to be the exploitation and degradation part. So the exploitation is something like, well, just the poor people will be donating the organs, right? This is almost certainly true if we would open like a global market for organs, right? So you might wonder if it's fine under normal conditions if you consent to having a deadly job or selling your organs, but the poor are in a position of being exploited in these cases of just having an enormous amount of wealth being put in front of their face, and this might invalidate the consent of donating organs or taking dangerous jobs. And this is certainly true that a global market for organs would be pilfering mostly from the poorer nations in the world. But what Dworkin says to this is that this is not a good objection because this is just what a market economy does. This is just what the price system does. So if this is objectionable, then we have to kind of reject the market economy, which is a bit more of an objection than probably most people are willing to make here. So it's not that the distributional consequences are good in his view. They're not bad, but if you want to say that they are bad, you have to point out what exactly is bad. And if you're pointing to the market, well, basically everything is allocated by the market, so it's not clear what is exactly specifically uniquely wrong here. So medical care in general is allocated by the market, mostly. There's some distortional features, but uh, it's not clear that medical care is no more or less objectionable under this objection than organ sales. So if you object to organ sales, you have to object to allocation of medical care by hospitals, by the price system. So, and Dworkin also points out that people don't usually pay for organs directly all the time. Sometimes they do, but a lot of cases it's the private and public insurers. So the worries here he thinks can be addressed by like just simple regulation policies on the sales, and you could institute some kind of distributional scheme. Um, so you could subsidize, if poor people couldn't get access, you could subsidize the purchase of organs for them. Um, but he also points out that the poor are disproportionately represented among the organ donors, but also the recipients. So they stand to benefit the most from this kind of open organ market. So all of this is pretty hard to see how you could object to organ sales if you're targeting the market. But one way to start questioning it is whether or not you would feel. One way to solve it is to say, well, the poor people are exploited by the rich people here, so we shouldn't allow poor people to sell organs. So if you think this is a good policy, just kind of ask yourself, so if you're taking college classes at UB, you probably are not in the kind of higher up echelon of income. So how would you feel if you couldn't buy organs, but people much richer than you could? That doesn't seem like a super fair deal. It's kind of paternalistic, especially towards people who are more disadvantaged than the rich people. So the way to solve this way to solve the distributional consequences seems to be not good. So Dworkin thinks that there is. So why does Dworkin think that we could be harmed by having too many choices, like the choice to sell organs? Could we not always refuse to act upon our additional option of selling and just donate? So why is the additional choice a harm to us? This is kind of by way of noticing that more choices are not always better. Additional choices don't always leave older options unaltered. So when organ sales are legal, families kind of might apply pressure to sell organs when they could have just donated it previously. So legalizing organ sales means people may lose out on money if they are pressured to donate their organs to a family member rather than sell to strangers. So imagine if your brother was in need of a kidney and he was just asking for it, but you could sell it for 40 grand. Seems to kind of like demean at least make it worse to be a donator in this case, right? Because you could have made money, but now you have to gift it. And also your brother could have bought it, but he chose not to. Maybe he's in a position where he couldn't afford it. And that would be probably more consistent with saving the value of the gift, but you would probably feel at least worse if you could have made money, even though it's not a lot, right? You'd still probably donate to your brother if you ask, but you would probably feel a little bit worse if you also could have gotten a lot of money for it on the market. So there's these psychic pressures here. that are placed on organ sales, but Dworkin stresses that while this is like a valid point, the case is that a lot of people are dying that need organs, and these social pressures are the less important thing to think about when you're thinking about policy. So the exact thing that's wrong with commodification of body parts due to the legalization of organ sales is something like the degradation argument that we mentioned earlier. And what this does is that it treats people with less value than they actually have. So you could use this to say why slavery, for instance, was wrong. Slavery was wrong because it treated people as less worthy than they actually were. So it demeaned them as persons because they're actually far more valuable than they were being treated as slaves. So the treatment of them is not consistent with their moral value as persons. So we'll get back to this in a bit, but this is just kind of an example of the quantification. The kind of trivialization of gifts. This is that so Dworkin mostly agrees for this. So he agrees that in the case of making a market for organs, it would trivialize the donation of organs, but this isn't a super good moral claim to rest the argument against organ sales on, because it simply is just the case that people don't have a right to their gift retaining some kind of special character. For instance, why do we think why should we preserve why should we not have a market for organs if it could save lives? But some people feel that their gift giving status is less than it was before the policy. It seems like a no-brainer in Dworkin's eyes that saving people's lives is more important than preserving the value of gifts. He also thinks that this will drive out altruism, which is that there will plausibly be less donations because people will not freely give their organs. So again, he kind of just leans on the fact that people's lives will be saved, and just because it might reduce altruism, that is donation of gifts, namely organs, right? This is not a good objection because we have to weigh this against the number of human lives we can save with policy. So one of the things that Dworkin brings up is this Charles Fried, who kind of points out, we were talking about the bodily autonomy stuff at the beginning of the lecture, and one way in which you might think that organ sales is bad is because it splits the body, and this is exactly what Fried is trying to prove. So he's kind of quoted as saying, "A man who sells himself treats his body as a foreign object. The shame of selling one's organs is just that one splits apart an entity that everyone knows should not be split apart." So what is wrong with organ sales? On this view, it's that you're alienating yourself from yourself. But there's some problems with this argument. With Fried's account, Dworkin points out that the argument against commodifying the body works also against the selling of other tissue that we currently accept. So the main problem with the objection is the shameful splitting of oneself, is that it undermines the legitimacy of organ donation. So if this is right, then organ donation is wrong as well. And since we think that organ donation is a pretty noble thing to do, there seems to be some kind of problem with Fried's argument. So most people are not willing to say that donating your hair is a problematic splitting of one's body. So his account is a bit too broad and picks out a bit too many things. So the kind of argument is this one. So if the wrongness of splitting a person by removing an organ, that's the P part of the argument, entails the wrongness of organ donation, Q, the claim that organ donation is wrong is false, not Q. So then we can infer that not P, which is we can infer that it's not the case if the wrongness of splitting a person by removing an organ, that it is wrong to split a person by removing an organ. So the conclusion is that, therefore, the claim that splitting a person by organ taking is wrong is false. So Dworkin kind of expects the absurdity of claiming that organ donation is wrong will make people reconsider this argument. So maybe this is not exactly the most charitable version of Fried's argument, but Dworkin we can point out that donation is governed by different norms. So there's a bit of a slippage here between Dworkin's argument and Fried's argument. So this would say, like, well, the cases that Fried is pointing out is not cases of donation. Donation are governed by different norms. He's pointing out one that is specifically the commodification and splitting in the case of organ sales. And an objection might be that property is alienable. So property by definition is something that is alienable, something that you can dispense with how you see fit. You can sell it. If you are your body, you cannot be separated from it. And it doesn't make sense to own all the parts, but not the whole. So it's arbitrary to own only some parts, to say that you only own some parts. So it seems like if you can't own your whole self because you can't alienate it, you don't own your parts. So this is some further building out needs to be done here with what's exactly wrong with Fried's argument. But the kind of point is that takeaway point is that it doesn't seem like in the case of splitting the body and donation is wrong, but it could. Dworkin claims it's not wrong, but it seems a bit more wrong in the case of organ sales. But it doesn't seem like Fried's argument's really proving that. So limiting sales to replaceable parts, we might think that there's something wrong with the selling irreversible body parts, so body parts that don't grow back, like kidneys. So the reversibility stuff, his kind of objection is that we currently allow permanent irreversible surgeries like sterilization or breast reduction surgeries, which are permanent. So why should we think that just because it involves sale, it's more wrong in this case? But in the case, so to kind of wrap up here, if we generalize the kind of lessons, we see that with organ sales, Dworkin claims that poor people can sell their organs in a manner that admitted of being voluntary. The implications would be more far-reaching than most people are willing to accept, namely that we'd have to prohibit poor people from accepting dangerous jobs, unless there's something different between accepting dangerous jobs and organ sales. If it's a fair analogy, then we have to accept that it would be overly paternalistic to prohibit poor people from selling their organs, if the analogy holds. So if the supply of organs is increased by introducing a market, then we have to weigh the welfare losses against the welfare gains, and we should probably, and he believes that it tilts in the favor of commodification and organ sales. The two main gains are the improved health for the recipients and the increased income for the sellers. There's seems to be Pareto improving. So Dworkin argues that no rights are violated by organ markets, and the overall good consequences favor implementing such a policy. So maybe you could also think about what it would look like to sell vital organs, and if leaving out vital organs is particularly problematic for Dworkin, I'd be happy to hear from that. But that is all I have for you this week, and I will talk to you next week.